Welcome, everybody, to this second of our panels in memory of and celebration of Marcellus Blount. Our topic is what it means to be free, Marcellus Blount's institution-building work. I'm Jean Howard, member of the English department, and I knew Marcellus best as an institutional colleague. That is, someone who worked with me and other colleagues over many years in the Department of English and Comparative Literature and also in the Institute for Research on Women and Gender. He gave a great deal to both communities, and he did it with style and grace and a lovely dash of self-deprecating humor that kept the good service from becoming a saccharine display of virtue. All of the colleagues on this panel have something to say about the Marcellus they knew as an institution builder. I'm going to introduce each of them quickly and indicate the topics each will address. And if you want to read more, the full bios are in the program. They're going to speak in the order that you see here. First will be Robert G. O'Mealy. Professor O'Mealy is the Zora Neale Hurston Professor of English and Comparative Literature and Director of Columbia's Center for Jazz Studies. He served on Columbia's faculty for 30 years. His new books are The Bearden Reader, which he recently edited for Duke University Press, and Antagonistic Cooperation, Collage, Jazz, and American Fiction, forthcoming from Columbia Press in 2020. His topic is You Have Looked Upon Chaos and Are Not Destroyed, a tribute to Marcellus Blount. Next is Jim Shapiro. Professor Shapiro joined Columbia's English department in 1985, the same time as Marcellus. He mostly teaches and writes about Shakespeare and advises productions of the plays in the US and the UK. He will be remembering Marcellus in 1987. Next is Zynga Frazer. Professor Frazer teaches in the Department of Africana Studies and Women's and Gender Studies at Brooklyn College and is a visiting professor in Columbia's new Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies. She received her master's from Columbia's Institute for Research in African American Studies and her PhD from Northwestern. She's finishing her first book, Sister Insider, Sister Outsider, Shirley, Chisholm, and Barbara Jordan, Black Women's Politics in the Post-Civil Rights Era, and her topic is Reflections on a Master Teacher and Institution Builder within the Institute for Research on African American Studies. Next is Richard Sachs. Professor Sachs has taught in Columbia's English department since 1978. His work focuses on the literary, mythic, and linguistic traditions of Greek, Old English, and Old Norse, and on biblical narrative, myth, modern epic, and the role of information technology in higher ed. He'll be remembering Marcellus through spreading the word, institution building one text and one colleague at a time. Next will be Jack Halberstram. Professor Halberstram is a member of the Department of English and Comp Lit and also directs the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality. He's the author of a number of books, his latest being Trans, a quick and quirky guide to gender variation, forthcoming from the University of California. And he's completing yet another manuscript, Wild Things, Queerness After Nature. His tribute is entitled Queer Black Masculinity. And finally, Joseph Slaughter. Professor Slaughter also teaches in Columbia's English department. He's the winner of many awards and fellowships, including a Guggenheim and a Lenfest Distinguished Faculty Award. He's the author of Human Rights, Inc., The World Novel, Narrative Form, and International Law, which won the Renee Wellick Prize for Comparative Literature and Cultural Theory. His title is Marcellus on Friendship. Please join me in welcoming all of these.
What I have to offer are fragments, as Kendall offered fragments. I don't have a song for you or a dance, but I want to talk a little bit about song and dance and give a short reading of a passage with institution-building implications from Invisible Man. I want to say to Marcellus's brother and sister who are here that there are many other brothers and sisters of Marcellus also in the room who feel for you and who remember him very, very dearly. He was a very close friend of mine and somebody I'm sure I'll never be finished being grateful for knowing. I also want to say that Ellie has done a fantastic job of putting this together, and no one can take for granted the amount of work that this entailed. And to start with the kind of prayerful dance and to move through the day in the way that you've orchestrated is really a wonderful treat for all of us. So I welcome the family, and I thank you so much. Concerning dance, my first little prefatory sliver is that Marcellus would do, when he was just overjoyed about something or very amused by the craziness of things, he would do a little dance, and I tell you, I better not do it. I'm not going to try. But some of you know what I mean, that he would step back and do just a dance of joy. And so I want to bring that up. I want to say that toward the end of his days, his vision continued to narrow and narrow and narrow, quite literally, as the disease closed in on him. And so at the end, he was reading on his cell phone. It was most convenient to see the text right before his eyes in that way. But it always struck me when he talked about having to read that way, how his vision has expanded and expanded and expanded, nonetheless, beyond the parameters that he was left with. You've heard already the quote in my title and elsewhere in the presentations today, that Marcellus liked to bring out the lines, "I have looked on chaos and survived." And at that point, he's quoting Invisible Man and a passage involving the character called True Blood that I want to say a couple of words about it in just a moment. And surely he looked on chaos and survived. And when he came back from Paris that time, who knew that he was going to make it? And yet somehow he had a buoyant spirit and an optimistic glint in his eye, and he had looked on chaos once again. This is not the first time. And managed to keep on going. And so I think about his surviving even into the moment that we are lucky to share today. I met Marcellus in 1979 when he was a graduate student at Yale, and I was lucky to be on sabbatical that year and teaching a course there with Robert Steptoe. And as far as institution building is concerned, that's an important part of the story, because he was at Yale at a time when Yale was building African American studies as an interdisciplinary force. And so you had very strong people in music and very strong people in visual art, Sylvia Boone and Robert Ferris Thompson. You had very good music in what was called then folklore, William Ferris and John Swed, John Blassingame in history. And so that the interdisciplinary thrust of his professional career was part of the air he breathed from that rich period at Yale, where at the law school, or whether you were elsewhere on campus, you had a sense that something was going on, that Charles Davis had put together a magnificent team. And so you met there Sterling Brown, and you met there Ishmael Reed, and we met Toni Morrison, and we felt like we were part of something that was much more than any one single discipline could ever hold. When I came to Barnard, my first job in the Columbia neighborhood, it was 1988, and at that time, Marcellus was here already, and it struck me very forcefully that he was quite literally teaching Invisible Man in the morning and then Aeschylus that night, and that for him, the pairing of the core curriculum and African American literature was quite a natural thing. And so for me, watching him put these things together in that way went beyond this sense of interdisciplinarity, but led to this sense of a very, very, very wide vision that he certainly did have. The passage that I want to talk about from Invisible Man is a passage in which True Blood commits the unforgivable sin of sleeping with his own daughter, impregnating her, infuriating his wife who wants to kill him with an axe, And there he is with both his wife and his daughter impregnated by him. So here he's committed this terrible transgression. And I remember talking about that with Marcellus, and you can see how, once again, Sophocles fits with Ellison at that point, where the heroic person is trying to decide what to do, and to destroy the mess, and finds out that he is the mess, that he has to confront and to keep on going in spite of that. Some of you remember that in that passage, when True Blood decides that he's not going to leave town and he's not going to kill himself, he's not going to give up, he falls down on his knees and he says, I don't know what I was singing. It was some kind of church song, I guess. All I knows is, he says, I ends up singing me some blues that night. I thinks and thinks until I thinks my brain gonna bust about how I'm guilty and how I ain't guilty. I can't drink nothing, and can't eat nothing, and can't sleep at night. But somehow he decides he's going to go back and face Kate, his wife, and face Maddie Lou and all of the chaos that he has to live with. And Ellison is invoking unamuno and the tragic sense of life. But more than that, he's invoking the blues that Ellison wrote about so magnificently, with gospel never far from the same riverbed of experience, in which you confront the fact that life is a low-down, dirty shame and things are going to fall apart, and yet somehow you continue in any way, somehow or other. But I bring all that up because Marcellus was reading Virginia Woolf as well as Ellison that term. And he said to me, it's not enough to celebrate True Blood. What about the daughter? What about the wife? What about the unborn children in this picture? Virginia Woolf said that after December 1910, nothing could ever be the same again. You couldn't forget that the servant serving the table had just as rich a life as the person sitting there, the person of privilege. And it was Marcellus, really, for me, who gave me the aha moment when I said, oh my goodness, I've been celebrating True Blood and heroism, but what I've been forgetting, that there's somebody else's name to be called as well. What would they say about these? How are they going to face these situations? Ellison didn't get that far, but Marcellus, in his own reading of things, most certainly did. And so this is a text that was full of ambiguity, which Ellison calls in one manuscript I've been working with ambivisibility. There are all these things going on at one time in the work. And Marcellus was able to see more than one of them at a time and more than one cluster of things at a time. Virginia Woolf said to follow the women, track them. And Marcellus was somebody who taught, I think, our department or helped teach us to do that. He also helped us to realize that there's a way to look through muddy water, as the blues song says, and see dry land, to keep on keeping on despite the tragic circumstances that we all live with, and to look at the craziness and death and sometimes the hopelessness of our situation environmentally and otherwise, and step back and somehow have that little happy dance to do anyway as we get ready for the next day and for the possibility of looking through chaos as we try to do and living on. Thank you.
First, let me just say that I'm honored to be here, grateful to Farah for extending that first invitation, and honored as well to be part of this panel and of this day. You've heard a lot today about the gentler side of Marcellus, his capacity for friendship, his passions and enthusiasm, his deep, deep capacity for friendship. All that is true and makes his loss all the more difficult to bear. But I'd like to focus on another side of this remarkable colleague that's less well-known, or at least less celebrated, his courage and his toughness in the face of injustice. And I'll be talking about Marcellus in 1987. We'd both joined the department at the same time, as Jean said, in the fall of 1985, which means that Marcellus had now been on campus for less than 2 years. and nearly 20 years had passed at Columbia since the spring of 1968, when Columbia's administration had last called New York City police onto this campus and where billy clubs were swung and heads cracked. There was a tacit agreement at the time that this sort of thing, which had also dented the university's reputation, would never happen again. But it did on Tuesday, April 21st, 1987. In response to racial violence on campus the previous month, which the administration had simply refused to address, there was a peaceful demonstration in front of Hamilton Hall, organized by the concerned Black students of Columbia. Unhappy about this, Columbia University's president at the time, Michael Sovereign, decided to bring the NYPD back to campus and also arranged for Columbia's security guards to be deputized to aid in the arrest of protesters. Technically, President Sovereign needed the approval of the University Senate's Executive Committee, of which Joan Ferrante was chair, but he never called Joan, never called many of the individuals on that committee, contacted one or two, and then went ahead, giving the go-ahead to the security forces to break up the student protest. My own recollection of that day is Marcellus had just finished teaching his morning literature humanities course. His teaching load at the time was 3 courses a semester, which was unusually onerous. He was leaving Hamilton Hall a little after 11 a.m. and stopped when he saw what was going on. And what was going on wasn't pretty and probably wasn't legal, since the security guards who were dragging off students to Amsterdam Avenue and waiting police vans had covered up their badges. Some of them at least had done so, which was against the law. There were 2 sets of arrests that day. The first took place a little bit after 11:30 a.m. when 6 students, 2 alum and 1 faculty member, Marcellus, were taken away and booked at the 26th precinct. The other, where many more were arrested, took place later that afternoon. Marcellus's arrest was made at the direct order of the Director of Columbia Security, Dominic Morrow, who was participating himself in these arrests, and if photographic evidence is any indication, did so with unusual relish. According to Marcellus, he was at the protest to take notes as an observer, and when a student, a senior named Mike Jones, was arrested, to ensure that Jones received medical attention for a cut on his head, as well as to give the protesters information on the individuals who had been arrested and how they may best contact their lawyers. Marcellus also told reporters at the time that Director of Security Morrow had approached him, and I suppose thinking that Marcellus was just another student, demanded to know, "Are you from Spectator?" the Columbia student newspaper. Morrow later claimed that he had asked Marcellus, "Are you a spectator?" on the grounds that if he were a spectator, he would have to move away from the scene. I should add that this wouldn't have made no difference at all, since Columbia Spectator reporters were themselves physically harassed and at least 1 arrested that morning. Now, Marcellus was not only young at this time, but he looked young, much younger than his, I think, 26 or 27 years at that point. And the Columbia security forces were simply not used to young African-American professors on this campus. So I can only assume that they thought that he was just another student agitator they had been authorized to arrest. When Morrow came up to Marcellus and challenged him, he called him son, at which Marcellus took umbrage and replied, "Don't call me son." And I can hear Marcellus saying those words. Morrow, there was a university investigation into this incident later. Morrow later claimed in his defense that Marcellus was baiting him, which is laughable to anybody who's ever met Marcellus, and that he'd called him sir, not son. You can decide for yourselves. According to reporters on the scene, Marcellus was then pulled away by Columbia security under the orders of Morrow outside on Amsterdam Avenue. The NYPD frisked him and then handcuffed him behind his back. There's a wonderful photo in the Columbia Spectator archives you can access online of a slim Marcellus in a beautiful crisp white shirt and dark tie in the back of a police van about to be hauled off to jail. After his release that day, Marcellus rejoined the students on campus and spoke at a rally, reminding the crowd, "2 Columbia students will be in jail tonight. What do you plan to do?" And there's another wonderful photograph of him on page 9 of the booklet commemorating this event, of him holding a bullhorn and addressing the crowd. The following day, Marcellus told reporters that he was considering resigning from the faculty because his rights as an educator were violated. And if you think about how extraordinarily difficult it was to get a tenure-track job in New York at an Ivy League school to boot, such a statement is remarkable and further testament to his courage and integrity. Marcellus only spoke with me once or twice in the 30 years we knew each other about this incident, and I recall him telling me on one of those occasions that he refused to leave jail because they suddenly realized they had a professor in the 2-6 precinct, and he spent 4 hours there until the vice president of arts and sciences, Martin Mizell, physically went there to get him out himself. The university quickly put its spin doctors to work, concluding that it was all just a misunderstanding, with both Marcellus and Director of Security Dominic Morrow, and I quote, attempting to serve the university in their respective roles. Martin Mizell issued a report a month later in which he said he asked the University Council to drop the charges against Marcellus. Yes, there were actually charges leveled against him, and recommended that an apology be issued to him, given, quote, the indignities he has suffered. Marcellus later told student reporters that President Sovereign never contacted him to find out what had happened or in any way to begin to address the violation. Marcellus added that he had obtained legal counsel since the incident, but he had not made any formal steps at filing any charges against the university or Morrow. Quote, I'm prepared to initiate any suit which is necessary if nothing is done. To protest Marcellus's arrest and the use of police force in the demonstration, a petition which had been spearheaded quickly by history professor Eric Foner was circulated and quickly signed by faculty members overnight. Among its demands, and I quote, a concerted effort to recruit and hire black faculty for both tenure-track and adjunct positions, in particular, the staffing of the African American Studies program for next year. And I'm only sorry that Marcellus, who played such a fundamental role in establishing the study of African American literature on this campus, did not live to see what has so recently been accomplished. There's a brief coda to the story. About 5 weeks ago, I was down in Louisiana lecturing at LSU. And while there, I was asked to give a talk at the Honors College. And the now graying dean of that Honors College was a professor named Jonathan Earl, who also happened to be a 1987 graduate of Columbia College and at the time a spec reporter. Our conversation turned back to that time and almost immediately to the events I've been describing, because Earl had been on the scene and arrested and jailed with Marcellus. Indeed, had been speaking with him at just the moment when Marcellus had been hauled off by Columbia's guards. He remembered with great clarity what it was like in the police cell with Marcellus, how Marcellus was wearing a white shirt and how that white shirt was bloody. And Earl recalled that Marcellus had been struck himself. I don't know if that was the case or whether it was the case of the bloodied student Marcellus, had been trying to help. Nor could he forget that he was also, and this is Earl, in Marcellus's class, that he was first exposed to the writing of Toni Morrison, now but not then part of Columbia's core curriculum. Earl, inspired by Marcellus and others at Columbia, went on to publish such important studies as Jacksonian Anti-Slavery and the Politics of Free Soil and the Rutledge Atlas of African American History. My conversation with him reminded me of how Marcellus's legacy lives on in so many ways, as does the memory of his courage and toughness that day 32 years ago. I miss Marcellus and will always remember him as that rarest of individuals, a gentle soul with a backbone of steel who looked on chaos and survived. Thank you.
So it is indeed an honor and a privilege to come before you today as a former student and alumni of IRAAS. So it may appear as an exaggeration that so many students and alum refer to IRAAS as a family. Professor Blount was our teacher, mentor, and for some students, he would also become a colleague. Professor Blount was a pillar of this family, and like any other family, we come together annually. Each holiday party, I anticipated seeing Professor Blount smile as I entered into the faculty house. I would also leave that party with him on the dance floor doing the electric slide or the cha-cha shuffle. At times, he would say to me, "Zinga, there is no need to be so serious all the time." I'm still working on that. And what appeared to be spontaneous outbursts of dance and jubilation, where you would inevitably find yourself in the middle of the floor in syncopated movement with others, until preparing my remarks, some of which I wrote for his memorial, I admit that I took for granted those moments and encounters, realizing that there's nothing simple or spontaneous about the radical freedom and asserting one's body in spaces that have not traditionally allowed Black bodies to exist. I realized that from the dance floor to his classroom, he was engaging and teaching us the importance of spatial disruptions. Dr. Blount, in his infinite wisdom, understood how important it was to show so many of us, especially graduate students and faculty, that you must never let any space or institution rob you of the sheer need and beauty to dance. This year, there was a missing spot on that dance floor, that his spirit allowed it to be commonplace for students and friends to part the seas and make an annual exodus to the dance floor after a long and brutal semester. As a historian and political scientist, I do not have empirical evidence, yet I believe that Professor Blount was one of the reasons why dancing has been institutionalized at IRAAS holiday parties. This act of creating and clearing spaces was one of his many gifts. So as a master teacher, what I call him a master teacher, Professor Blount taught his students to be methodical readers of text and prose. A lover of Baldwin, Dunbar, and Morrison, he forced us to engage in rigorous critical analysis around gender and sexuality as well as race. His class on Baldwin was essential for IRAAS students. There was an intellectual generosity and a selflessness that created more than a safe space within his classroom. He understood as students in IRAAS and those committed to work on subjects and subject matter of marginalized people, that despite their rigorous training, their scholarship could be questioned. As a mentor, he helped so many students navigate places that at times questioned their legitimacy. So as an institutional builder, in those early years of the Institute, with few faculty, he worked tirelessly to ensure robust course offerings at IRAAS. And I know that he would be overwhelmed and overjoyed for this announcement. He already knew that the IRAAS would materialize itself into a department. Dr. Blount played a strategic role in building IRAAS as a department. First as a director of IRAAS and the director of graduate studies. In his article in Souls entitled A Spelling of My Name, which was written in response to IRAAS's 10th anniversary in Black Study, he writes, he provides a strategic irreverence arguing that Black studies at Columbia should not replicate other departments, that the beauty was the opportunity to create something new on our own terms. He writes, If we embrace the challenge of moving beyond the boundaries, we can envision a new beginning of African American studies at Columbia as the creation of an actual department where African American scholars need not be authorized or authenticated by departments that best serve other departments. African American Studies Department frees scholars to break down boundaries, to establish the new connections, to become reinventions in ways that insist upon academic rigor, creativity, and freedom. As an institutional builder, he allowed colleagues and students like myself to reimagine Black studies along with other individual works that were not confined to institutional liminality, but embraced interdisciplinary work. The beauty in Professor Blount was his quiet nature. If you look closely, he taught you how to be a colleague and a mentor with integrity. His compassion and kindness cannot be overstated. My late father would say that life is not the beginning of the day that you are born, or the day that you die, but life is comprised of what you did between the dash. At this symposium, we have begun to interrogate and examine Dr. Blount's life, yet I dare to think that we have just touched the surface to explore his many contributions between that dash. I leave you with this poem that I believe surmises what we have gained and in part what we have lost. I think it's poignant because it is a tribute given to James Baldwin at his funeral by his dear friend Maya Angelou. And the poem is titled When Great Trees Fall. And part of this is, like I said, what I said at his funeral. When great trees fall, rocks on distant hills shudder, lions hunker down in tall grasses, and even elephants lumber after safety. When great trees fall in forests, small things recall into silence, their senses eroded beyond fear. When great souls die, the air around us becomes light, rare, sterile. We breathe briefly. Our eyes briefly see a hurtful clarity. Our memory suddenly sharpened, examines, gnaws on kind words unsaid, promise walks never taken. Great souls die, and our reality bound to them takes leave of us. Our souls, dependent upon their nurture, now shrink. Our minds, formed and informed by their radiance, fall away. We are not so much maddened as reduced to the unutterable ignorance of dark, cold caves. And when great souls die and a period of peace blooms slowly and always irregularly, spaces fill with a kind of soothing electric vibration. Our senses restored, never to be the same, whisper to us, they existed. They existed. We can be better, for they existed. Dr. Marcellus Blount existed so that I and many others may not only exist, but thrive. Thank you.
I will try to hold it together. Let me just begin by seconding and thirding and fourthing the thanks to Ellie and to Farah and to Jean, and of course our thoughts continue to be as they have been every day for the last many months with Marcellus' sister and brother. I met Marcellus almost 35 years ago when he first arrived at Columbia. We were both teaching literature humanities, which, as most of you here today know, is Columbia's long-standing and perhaps fatally flawed year-long Great Books of the Western Tradition course required of all Columbia College undergraduates. The areas of expertise Marcellus and I brought to the table in teaching that course could not have been more different, to say the least. And looking back, I can't really remember how it happened that we started hanging out together, much less why in the world Marcellus would have wanted to talk shop with an underread Indo-European philologist. And of course, the gaping divide between our fields of expertise was in many ways the least of the differences between us, given what I'll simply call our radically different backgrounds and lifestyles. He did not call me into his office to discuss a new shirt, for sure. But even though I can't clearly remember our first exchanges, it is inspiringly clear to me as I look back at our long friendship how Marcellus started to play a critical role before that first year ended in contributing to the transformation of my intellectual and spiritual life. What that entailed, and what I'd like to focus on for a few minutes this afternoon, is an aspect of Marcellus's institution building that was far less publicly visible than many of his other efforts. Namely, his relentless generosity and dazzling patience in taking the time to expose colleagues to, and also help them carefully work through, texts they didn't know, and which could lead them, corny as it does sound, to broaden their horizons. Marcellus understood that doing so could potentially prove institution building in the long term by the effect it had on a wide range of things, from the diversity of thought in his colleagues' research and teaching to their perspectives on and contributions to things like Columbia's controversial core curriculum. He also understood, of course, that such a process had to be private and informal. After all, who among us, against our reason, against our will, against our reason, and against our character, almost messed up that quote, was going to publicly sign up for the time-consuming meetings of the text you've never read but should have, anonymous society? Hi, I'm Richard, and I haven't read nearly wide enough. Of course, Marcellus had his work cut out for him with someone like me who spent his time wallowing in Homer and Beowulf and Indo-European linguistics. But over the years, he repeatedly, yet with his exquisite delicacy, made sure we spent many an hour immersed in many a text I hadn't read. It started in that first year of our acquaintance with Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, which he then gently suggested I could use as my so-called instructor choice text to conclude my literature humanities syllabus, which I did, and which was followed over the years by one text after another, and which blossomed most fully in a decades-long immersion in the poetry of Derek Walcott, especially his Nobel-winning prize Omeros, all the way up to 18 months ago, in what sadly turned out to be the last corpus to which Marcellus had the chance to introduce me, the collection of astonishing sonnets written by Gwendolyn Brooks. I realize, of course, that introducing Zora Neale Hurston to one colleague, even in the mid-1980s, doesn't sound very radical, and certainly not like much of a step in institution building. But Marcellus took the long view. So multiply this approach by colleague after colleague, text after text, year after year, cycling through decades of curricular reviews, hiring processes, et cetera, and one gets another glimpse of the subtle ways in which Marcellus was such a profound agent of change. But it wasn't just the act of spreading the words that contributed to this aspect of Marcellus's effectiveness as an agent of change. It was the way he did it, deploying his uncanny ability to bridge the widest of chasms. So in the spirit, not to mention the method, of this text-based component of his chasm-bridging institution building, I will spend the last few moments of my remarks very briefly sharing a close reading of one feature among the many infinite horizons we are asked to distantly see and read in Omeros, the text which Marcellus and I explored together more than any other, and one which I believe gets to the heart and soul of why his institutional as well as personal bridge building was so powerful and so freeing. Omeros, with its more than 300 pages, let me see if this thing comes out, okay. Omeros, with its more than 300 pages of unbearably beautiful verse, is a poem which at its core is about the spiritual challenge of healing impossibly incurable wounds, something Marcellus knew all too much about, alas. The wound central to the narrative structure of Omeros, as I'm sure many of you know, is the wound of slavery. We see this early on in the poem in the disabling wound caused by a rusted anchor suffered by a St. Lucian fisherman named Philoctete, who, we are told already in chapter 4, and you can see it in the screen in number 1, believed that the swelling came from the chained ankles of his grandfathers, or else why was there no cure? That the cross he carried was not only the anchor's, but that of a race for a village black and poor. But in the first section of the very first chapter, before the poem goes back in time to begin narrating its story, which includes Philoctet's interpretation of his wound, which I just quoted, we are asked to note that his wound actually has been healed. So less than 20 pages in, the poem has in essence challenged us to imagine a process in which such an utterly incurable wound can somehow impossibly heal. Go up a little bit. Oh, sorry. Okay. I only build websites for my courses. Other than that, I'm technically hopeless. And what does that healing process turn out to involve? Well, there are, of course, many aspects to the poem's attempts at healing, and a central one which emerges has to do with the ancestral journeys which dominate the first half of the text. In particular, there is the evolution of another St. Lucian fisherman named Achille, who is essentially the poem's protagonist and who takes an impossible journey back 300 years to his ancestral village in West Africa. Marcellus made fun of me when I said we should then talk about compound name morphology in Yoruban, so we never got there. Anyway, he takes takes an impossible journey back 300 years to the ancestral village in West Africa, a complicated dream journey which agonizingly culminates in Achille witnessing the slavers raiding the village and dragging his ancestors off into the holds of the slave ships. It is a singular and excruciating moment, but not singular in every sense, as it turns out. For what Achille witnesses there ends up being reenacted many chapters later. You can see this in numbers 2a and 2b, which are side by side. Line by excruciating line for more than 15 lines, including with identical line endings, but in an utterly different world, when the narrative somehow, without us quite knowing how it happened, ends up taking us to the Dakota Plains in the mind's eye of a white woman named Catherine Weldon, who is living among the Sioux when she witnesses their massacre, presumably at Wounded Knee. These are excruciating moments and incurable wounds indeed, separated by unbridgeable expanses of time and space, and of course of race as well. But the narrative seems to suggest that perhaps we can transcend such expanses if we can see beyond our individual incurable wounds. And indeed, Achille seems to do just that and begin our journey to the world of Catherine Weldon when he returns from Africa, and as he washes his canoe while listening to Bob Marley's Buffalo Soldier, imagines himself turned into that oppressor Buffalo Soldier, looking at the expressions on the wounded faces of his imagined Sioux victims. What the poem is clearly building towards here as it begins to move on to its narration of the healing of Philoctet's wound, it's the idea that if we can somehow, on some level, impossibly and simultaneously embrace and relive not only our own wounds, but also the equally incurable wounds of others, then perhaps there is hope that, and for this I quote a single verse near the end of the poem, a verse which is comprised of three separate voices from three separate sentences. The bolded line in number 3, in time too, we shall all heal the incurable. Marcellus seemed to understand this impossible multi-voice proposition every day, or at least much more sustainedly than the rest of us, and that he did so without resorting to self-delusion was beyond remarkable. And I believe this understanding is what fueled the healing spirit and the healing language of his institution building. For Marcellus also knew, to end with spreading some final words from Homerus, that like Philoctet's wound, this language carries its cure, its radiant affliction. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Jack Halberstram. I'm the current director of the Institute for Research on Gender, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies here at Columbia. And, you know, in many ways, that institute, it sort of resonates with Marcellus's legacy. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and then say some words about his intellectual legacy in relationship to queer studies, which seems really important and might echo some of the things that have been said already today. You can see signs of Marcellus's presence in the Institute, both in relationship to the intellectual atmosphere there and its complete kind of, recognition of queer studies. Queer studies is not a separate thing at all in this institute, as it is in some gender studies programs around the country. But the other place to look for the legacy of someone, honestly, is in terms of the atmosphere in the institutional site itself. And so I really enjoyed reading Khadija Belli's words in the program. If you want to know what kind of institution builder somebody was, ask the staff, basically. And Khadija, the program director, had, and speaking on behalf of many of the people who had staffed that office, remarked upon the fact that Marcellus did not see the office staff as people who were there just to make photocopies or something, but was genuinely interested in people's lives. And Khadija wrote, he was someone who remembered other people. And that, for all the institution building is about creating classes, curriculum, bringing people together intellectually and so on, an institute also lives in the way in which people experience the relations that the university imposes upon us. And the fact that Marcellus was able to interact with everybody in the Institute with an equal sense of purpose and grace speaks about the institution builder that he was. He was a natural fit for gender and sexuality studies, and I was really moved by the oral history clip that Ellie played for us this morning. And I was moved that in that oral history clip, what Marcellus had to say was about his own intersectional education and the moment that he woke up to, or he recognized that the project that he had around African American studies at Columbia was completely linked to the representation of women on campus. And for anyone who ever came into contact with Marcellus, you'll know that that was not a throwaway line, and that feminism was a very deep part of who Marcellus was and what his work on masculinity was about. He didn't, as I experienced Marcellus intellectually, he didn't have to struggle to make a connection between race, sexuality, and gender. Those connections were the very fabric of the way that he thought. But also, if you hung out with Marcellus, you realize very quickly that his most important friendships and contacts were with women. I never hung out with Marcellus when he didn't mention Farah to me. We've got to go out with Farah, we've got to hang out with Farah. And his sister as well, Valerie, he would talk to me about Valerie all the time. So the feminism that, could be conjured up in a kind of ideological mode was also, for Marcellus, inscribed in his relationship with women, with queer bodies, and with community, as Kendall explained to us earlier. And I want to also go to the essay on the elegy in a moment. But I thought a lot about Marcellus before I get there recently when I went to a film festival at BAM that included a lot of Marlon Riggs films. I'm not sure if anyone else made it to that. But I don't remember whether, I must have seen Black Is, Black Ain't, but it was as if I was watching it for the first time. Now, when you watch Black Is, Black Ain't, that was Marlon Riggs' last film. It was made while he was dying of AIDS, and at least half of it is him in a hospital bed, directing from the bed and explaining, teaching his students really how to craft this final work. And I thought a lot about Marcellus then. This was very much his community. This was really about the time in which he probably became HIV positive. And the film was absolutely about this lost and dying generation, particularly of black men. And I actually do remember hearing from friends of mine who were students of Marcellus's when he seroconverted. And people were just so sad at that time and thought that this was it for Marcellus. And I remember then when I was coming to Columbia thinking how amazing it was that, in his words, he was still here. And, I only got to overlap with him for 2 years, but those 2 years were really, really important to me because I was able to solidify the friendship that I had with Marcellus as a kind of acquaintance. We were able to spend real time together. And thinking about this survival, early seroconverters did not survive that period. It's really an incredible thing, and Marcellus was very proud of his medical legacy as much as anything, and of the fact that he, against all odds, even in that last illness, was still here. And, I really hope that we're going to be able to read that memoir of his at some point. Now, excuse me, the legacy that Marlon Riggs and Essex Hempel left behind was a legacy that I believe, and this is where I connect very strongly with Kendall's remarks, that Marcellus took up knowingly as a black seroconverted gay man. He understood that being still here, it bestowed upon him a certain obligation to tell stories and to witness for people who could not be here. And that is very much, as Kendall showed us, the reason for this incredible piece on the elegy in African American poetry and his careful reading of Paul Laurence Dunbar's elegy for Frederick Douglass. This is a little passage that Kendall did not read from the essay. 1895, the year of Douglass's death, marks a bleak moment in black history. The work of the poem is to convince Dunbar's readers that the black generations from which Douglass's leadership issues will continue without him. And Dunbar insists those generations will persist because of him. Still thy voice is ringing o'er the gale. Dunbar, in fact, is able to initiate a tradition of African-American elegy. His poems of the late 19th century inspire a tradition that thrives even among poets writing today. And you can't help thinking that this was the legacy that Marcellus then took up. He, too, was writing at a bleak moment in black history, a time when black men and women were vastly overrepresented in the numbers of deaths from HIV/AIDS, and up to 10 times more likely to have the disease than white people. The same year that Marcellus published this essay on the elegy, there was a report issued by Columbia University on AIDS that outlined the reasons for this unbalanced rate of infection, calling attention to the need for more affordable housing, education possibilities, and outreach to black community on the topic of HIV/AIDS. But the report also noted the impact of increased incarceration rates on black men who had no access often to condoms in prison or treatment for HIV/AIDS. So it's within that context that we have to understand Marcellus's survival, and it's within that context that this essay on the elegy emerges. He is the poet singing the elegy who survives to do so precisely because so many did not. He says of Dunbar in relationship to Douglass, here we find the work of mourning somewhat incomplete. and he scans Dunbar's sense of deep loss in relationship to Douglass and his sense of Douglass's blast-defying power of thy form, which extends comfort through the lonely dark. So I just want to suggest then that Marcellus may have taken up the mantle of writing the collective elegy to several generations of dead or dying young black gay men, but he also reveled in the joys of the legacies that he inherited. And I think for anyone who knew Marcellus, you'll know that it wasn't just a kind of pessimistic grieving. It was also a celebration of the work of people like Marlon Riggs and Essex Hempel that he taught and that in many ways he embodied. His homage to the lost black men of his generation came in the form of what? An ecstatic relationship to life, often expressed, as we've heard, in dance, often in teaching, sometimes in his perambulations around the city. On any given night, and I remember one night in particular when he came to my partner's book party all the way over in Brooklyn, and he was quite frail. I did not think he would make it, and there he was. He arrived, and at the end of the night, I said, Marcellus, let me get you a cab home. He's like, what do you mean? And I said, let me get you a cab home back up town. He's like, I'm not going home. I was like, oh, okay. And he's like, oh, no, don't worry. I'm going to Chelsea. He went to Chelsea. Saw him the next day, and he's like, oh, I had a fantastic time. I mean, I didn't actually know how he had made it to Brooklyn in the first place. So this was Marcellus at his finest. He was, sorry that he might miss the Williams sister at a tennis tournament, that he might miss a Yankees game. He was always going to concerts, watching ballet, or eating out. His fierce embrace of life was justification enough for his unlikely longevity. And this is what continued to shine through even in his last years as he began to fade. Now, just a few more things that I want to say, and then I do want to end with this Essex Hempel poem. And that is, while Marcellus didn't publish a huge amount of work, what may not be known is that he taught a whole generation of queer studies scholars. And just off the top of my head, I will name Chandan Reddy, Gayatri Gopinath, Neville Hode, Hiram Perez, queer students of color who were here when he was, at a way less hospitable time in the history of Columbia. As I recall, it was not a very good place to be as a queer studies scholar, and he was there for all of those scholars, many of whom still cite him as an influence. It was not cool to be queer then. There was no embrace of queer studies then, but Marcellus took it upon himself to mentor those students. He mentored me when I came here. I know he was a large part of hiring me. I remember talking to him about my job talk. I gave him my title, and it was like the epistemology of the blah, blah, blah. He's like, no. He said no. 3 titles I had to go through. He's like, okay, that will work. He talked me through every piece of it, and I am literally here at Columbia in part because of Marcellus. To conclude then, dancing, poetry, and queer masculinity, queer life were his passions, or at least the ones I knew about. And life in the shadow of an epidemic was for him a practice rooted in love and literature. I miss Marcellus as we all do. I admired the way he lived, and even more so, the way that he accepted his own impending death with grace and courage. The poetry of Essex Hempel perhaps captures better than I can the energy of Marcellus and his spirit, his restless, curious nature, and his quest for what Essex Hempel calls better days. Hempel writes, and I wonder where stamina comes from to search all night until my footsteps ring, awake the sparrows, and I go home, ghost walking, driven indoors to rest my hunter's guise, to love myself as fiercely as I have in better days. Hempel's poetry appears throughout Black Is, Black Ain't. It is the soundtrack to that period of death and dying for Black gay men. In this poem, he describes cruising and tending to, quote, the code of my kind, which he claims to know, quote, better than I know the national anthem or the Lord's Prayer. Hempel, speaking for gay men on the streets and in the clubs, describes a quest for pure pleasure beyond restraint. He speaks of a playboy's freedom to take on impractical relations with men whose names, quote, I will forget by sunrise. I don't say that Hempel speaks for Marcellus, a gay man who wore his heart and his pleasures on his sleeve, but I do say that queerness is this relationship to the impractical. It is a belief in living when all around you are dying, a desire for pleasure when all around is pain, a desire for community even in the lonely dark. Marcellus made and thrived in the communal. He moved through different communities at different times in his life, and he assembled intimacies as he went. Some were close and sustaining, others distant but durable. Weak as he was in his last few months, Marcellus fought hard every day to be in the world and of the world, as Fred Moten might say. He did not fade into the fate of an untimely death, nor did he withdraw from life as so many people do as they feel themselves disappearing. Like the hunter in Hempel's poem, Marcellus was hungry till the end for experiences, for contact, for love and desire.
So I want to start by actually thanking Marcellus for bringing us all here. That seems to me part of the legacy, of an institutional legacy, to have us all in this room this afternoon. I'm so glad and so happy to have Valerie and Tony here with us today as well. I also want to mention, since this is at least nominally this panel is supposed to be about institution building, that at least 3 of us on this panel owe our presence here at Columbia to Marcellus Blount. Jack was perhaps the last person that Marcellus hired. He was the chair of the search committee that hired Jack. He was the chair of the search committee that produced me as the junior post-colonialist in the year 2000. Bob, I know Bob owes a lot to Marcellus in those ways as well. So the very fact that we're in this room and that these people are speaking to us today has to do with Marcellus. The last thing I want to say by way of introduction is, not surprisingly, for a task like this, I procrastinated. And it was about midnight last night that a spirit of Marcellus came to me to tell me a little bit about Melvin Dixon and the title of the hymn that Kendall sang. So this talk will be a bit about that same topic. I'm the last speaker on this panel, which seems appropriate at this point in the program, since I'll be talking about closure, or rather about the ambivalent desire for and denial of closure. When I was asked for a title for my remarks today, I said I would speak about Marcellus and on friendship. That topic was obvious for me, not only because he was a very close friend who had been working for years on a critical study of male friendship in African American literature, but because I learned so much from him about friendship. I will, in the end, talk implicitly about friendship as I speak explicitly about closure. I'm going to begin with the very mundane, a short text message exchange. Whoop, we're in the wrong place. I will begin with the mundane, a short text message exchange with Marcellus from spring 2017, 2 years ago almost to the day, indeed it was yesterday evening, when he was recovering from a round of terrible new maladies that had all but broken him and that seemed to spur an intense desire to write or to plan for a future of writing. I'm writing my talk for next semester, he messaged me. Fear of closure, love, friendship, and moonlight. Knowing something of what he was facing, I replied with encouragement, "Oh, very nice, but that also sounds a bit gut-wrenching." "I cry every time I watch it," Marcellus wrote back, referring to the film Moonlight. "I've written the outline and about half a draft." "That's great, Marcellus. I'm very glad to hear it." "A kind of coda to the friendship book," he added. "Good form," I exclaimed, "since a coda begs the question of closure, represents a sort of formal fear of closure." "Precisely," he affirmed. I have a number of these iMessage exchanges with Marcellus from the past few years, in which he delivered the first line for a paper or a chapter or for the memoir he intended to write. I came to understand that he sometimes used the conceit of the first line or of the last line of an essay that he was planning as a sly way to deliver information to me that he was anxious about, or to test the potential shock value of a particular formulation on what he imagined was a shockable audience. Marcellus had been working on what he sometimes referred to as his friendship book for a very long time. It is variously listed in a number of bios for talks he gave over the past decade as currently working on or as recently completed. The manuscript also appeared under various titles, but always with the same main title, Listening for My Name, African American Men and the Politics of Friendship. Marcellus drew his title, Listening for My Name, not from the consolatory hymn, I'll Be Somewhere Listening for My Name, but from the title to the last public talk given by the black gay poet Melvin Dixon. Shortly before he came, as Dixon says in that last talk, one of those men lost to AIDS. Dixon's title, I'll Be Somewhere Listening for My Name, was, however, taken from the gospel hymn, and so by a deferral and a detour that insists on memory and friendship, in particular on remembering an old friend, Marcellus's title gets back to the hymn only by way of that detour through Dixon's own meditation on closure, instantiating something of the politics of friendship that he was examining in literature. For this occasion, I've been reading through some of Marcellus's late writings, notes and fragments that were prepared for various presentations and for various purposes, trying to get a sense of the link and the emphasis he was after when he placed friendship so consistently close to closure. What kind of closure and what kind of friendship did he imagine intertwined so intimately? Those two themes of friendship and closure, combined succinctly in the text messages he wrote me, emerge repeatedly in those loose pages that I've been reading, even when he's writing about Romare Bearden and Odysseus' homecoming at the end of the Odyssey. Those pages are also haunted by Melvin Dixon's final lecture. In those notes, Marcellus repeatedly cites two passages from Dixon's talk to set the frame for his own work on friendship and closure, whether it's for considering the role of friendship among black male writers, which might, as he writes, queer African American literature and define a new canon, or for exploring the narrative logic of black futurity in Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, or for identifying the work of tropes and the tropes at work in what he called post-AIDS literature, in order to theorize a body of writing that he says allows for alternative futures, turning extravagant abjection into sustained personhood. The lines between the various book projects, the nascent memoir as much as the more academic and activist literary scholarship, blur quickly in these notes. Whew, he writes at one point, this is to be a long book. I'll have to effect closure, but where and how does closure suggest a new beginning? The passages that Marcellus quotes from Dixon are extremely moving. One of them, Kendall quoted as well. And those who knew Marcellus as a friend or who heard Kendall earlier can see immediately why they occupied his mind and his writing. I come to you bearing witness to a broken heart. I come to you bearing witness to a broken body, but a witness to an unbroken spirit. Perhaps it is only to you that such witness can be brought and its jagged edges softened a bit and made more meaningful. The second passage from Dixon that Marcellus cites repeatedly comes after Dixon lists what he had already lost in that last speech. Not only a lot of weight and vision in one eye, as Marcellus remarks in his own notes on his own loss of vision, his libido and last lover and too many friends, but also, as Dixon says, almost more emphatically than those losses, the future tense from my vocabulary. My life is closing, Dixon wrote. Oh, I know all the cliches. We all have to die, and everything comes to an end. But when is an ending a closure, and when does closure become a new beginning? You have already heard the echo of this line from Dixon in Marcellus's own self-reflective commentary on the challenges of writing. This is to be a long book. I'll have to effect closure, but where and how does closure suggest a new beginning? Late in Dixon's lecture, he comments on the curious lot of writers and their fear of closure. We begin our projects with much apprehension about the blank page, Dixon writes, but then as the material assumes its life, we resist writing the last stanza or paragraph. We want to avoid putting a final period to it all. Readers are no better. In African American novels and poetry, in Black and queer texts, in post-AIDS literature, Marcellus was ever alert to the tropes and other formal mechanisms that, as he put it, allow us to read beyond the ending. Although he personally lived with endings for a very long time, he also looked forward to living beyond endings. He was especially invested, as he writes in one note, in the status of the past imperfect and the future perfect, in the I was writing and I will have written, or the I was reading and I will have read of a life in letters. Indeed, as literary tenses indicative of life itself. In fact, the future tense and future traces never did disappear from Marcellus's vocabulary. I am writing my talk for next semester, fear of closure, love, friendship, and moonlight, as if the closure feared in the second half of that sentence might somehow be delayed by the progressive act of writing about love, friendship, and moonlight in the beginning, or by the mundane act of writing a text to a friend about writing a coda on friendship. In giving a perspective book on friendship the title of the last talk by a friend lost to AIDS, Marcellus implicitly responded to Dixon's question, when does closure become a new beginning? Sometimes Marcellus cites the short sentences that follow Dixon's question, but they usually appear in these pages broken up and scattered throughout Marcellus's own fragments as the traces of a deeply digested imperative. When does closure become a new beginning, asked Dixon? Not always. It's not automatic. We have to work at it. If an end is termination, closure involves the will to remember, which gives new life to memory. If today we might say that we have some closure at the loss of our beloved friend and colleague, it is only because we insist on working on it, on giving new life to his memory, by remembering him at this beginning moment of the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, for which, as we've heard, he gave so much of his career and his life. I want to end today more or less where we began, with a coda and a dance in the form of a coda. In a presentation on post-AIDS literature, Marcellus himself ended with this clip from the 2011 tribute to World AIDS Day by the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater. In his notes on this clip, Marcellus writes, "This dance, entitled Home, helps me to conceptualize what I am testing with this term post-AIDS literature. Watch the dancers soar again and again with a cacophony of limbs," and he says, "Read beyond the ending. Invest in love's futures." Thank you.
I really want to thank my colleagues for this series of fabulous tributes to Marcellus. And to end this day, I'd like to introduce Dennis Mitchell, who, and I want to get this right, the Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement and Senior Associate Dean for Diversity. Dennis.
What a wonderful afternoon. And please, just one more time, please congratulate both the panel and the roundtable. Just outstanding here. I want to thank Farah and Maya for inviting me to close this afternoon on behalf of the university. But Ellie, thank you so much for what you have done for all of us. On behalf of Marcellus, it's just been a wonderful afternoon to be here, and I've smiled a moment or two, fought back a tear or two, but most of this afternoon has been just pleasure. From the beginning of our statuesque dancer all the way to this final clip, so thank you very much. It's really quite an honor to close this celebration of the life of our dear colleague and friend, Marcellus. And it really has been a fitting tribute this entire afternoon. When I think of Marcellus and his legacy, the two words that immediately come to my mind are heart and soul. He left an indelible mark on those that he taught, he worked with, and he mentored. In the early years of the Faculty Diversity Initiative, we both worked very closely with Jean Howard and knew of each other, and our paths crossed occasionally. But it was when I assumed the vice provost role nearly a decade later that Marcellus was really one of the first people to reach out to me with congratulations and support. And that might seem, simple to some, a simple gesture, but to me, it really meant so much to hear those early words of encouragement and from such a deeply respected member of our Columbia community. In the years that followed, Marcellus continued to be an invaluable ally and advisor. Marcellus was one of those people who brought an immediate smile to your face when you saw him. I characterize his smile as sort of warm and beautiful, but slightly mischievous. And any of you who know him know exactly what I mean. That was the last time I saw him was at the Queer Disruptions 2 conference at the end of February last year. And no exception when I looked across the room and saw that smile. That conference was an outgrowth of our LGBTQ scholarship initiative, which really brought an amazing group of new faculty in gender and sexuality studies to the Columbia community. Marcellus played a key role, and Jack described it earlier, really a key role in shaping and the implementation of the LGBTQ initiative in the Queer Disruptions Conference. I know when I noticed him across the room, it had really been a while since I had seen him because he was so ill, and I was a little heartbroken because I was traveling when his book was presented. I'm still here, so I missed it in the fall, so I just hadn't seen him. We exchanged some emails, congratulations from me and a couple of emails back and forth, but I hadn't physically seen him, so he put such a smile on my face when I did. And during the next break, of course, we exchanged warm greetings, and I took the opportunity to connect, and we really just spent the whole break just sitting and talking and seeing how he was doing, as it had really just been way too long. The conference really felt more complete with him there. And I'm so grateful that he was able to participate in such a seminal event that he helped make possible in the first place. There's a saying that you should always strive to leave a place better than how you found it. And Marcellus surely did that, and more at Columbia. He saw it all, really, in 30-plus years that he was here, starting his career as one of a very few black faculty members on campus, and ultimately becoming a prominent voice in an active and long-standing faculty diversity initiative. His grace and leadership helped to shepherd our community through countless challenges and periods of reinvention over the past 3 decades. His friendship and unfailing optimism were gifts to all of us, and his impact will never be forgotten. Thank you all for helping us pay tribute to Marcellus today, and we hope going forward. It's my pleasure, really, to do 2 last things, and one is to welcome all of you to the continued celebration, which is occurring outside here at 5 p.m. for the new department, African American and Diasporic Studies. It's just quite a long term. So we're calling it AAADS in our office because it's just much easier. But we welcome you to that celebration. It's so fitting that this celebration for Marcellus is occurring back to back with this. He would be tickled. He would just love it. So please come and celebrate with us for that. And I also get the wonderful pleasure of formally introducing his family that's here with us, and that's Valerie and Tony Blount. Would you both please stand? And even better yet, the last words go to Valerie. Come on up, Valerie.
Thank you so much for allowing me and my brother to be here. My brother's a strong silent type, so he's going to let me speak for both of us. I think it's absolutely wonderful that you guys have put together this program. I know Marty's here. I know he's loving it. And I really appreciate it. I want to thank Ellie Hassana and Maya Tolstoy. Thank my dear friend, Marty's dear friend, and my dear friend, Farah. All the people that made it possible for this event. I'm sure there's so many behind-the-scenes people that I could not even think of who to, of everybody to thank, but thank you all. I know that I've always appreciated Columbia for being Marty's other family. You always hear for him, and he loved teaching here. He loved his students. He loved Black Studies. You guys probably don't know this, but when Marty first went to college, he wanted to be a lawyer, and then he changed it to Black Studies. And I feel very honored that I was the one to introduce him to Black literature when he was 13. And I was taking a course in Black Studies by John Williams. And I was bringing home some books, and we just loved talking about it. You know, some people come to mind who really helped me when Marty passed away. Of course, Farah, Joey, Jennifer, Bob, George, Prudence, Sandra, and in a time when it was extremely difficult for me. You helped me with the logistics of taking care of my brother's affairs, and I'll never forget that. There isn't very many days that go by that I don't think about Marty. You know, I miss his playfulness. I miss us dancing together and listening and appreciating music. I miss his dating advice. We're both gay. And, you know, I remember him always telling me to not worry about finding Miss Right. Just deal with Miss Right now. Be happy with that. You know, I miss all those things about him. But, you know, he always shows up every now and then, and I'm grateful. You know, my brother, I had no idea how much of a big shot he was here, you know. It wasn't like him to brag, you know. He loved recognition, but he did not seek it. He loved it if it was just given. And I'm just blown away with how influential he was here, you know, and you know, it just makes me love him even more. I truly believe that names mean something, and the name Marcellus, the Latin term, Latin meaning is God of War. The French meaning is young warrior, and my brother was a young warrior. He overcame humble beginnings. He overcame so much loss as a young adult in college, where many of his friends died. He overcame debilitating illness. He never once complained about it. He just kept on pushing on. That was the warrior in my brother. He told me once, because he had to come, he was thinking about staying with me in Virginia, and he decided not. He was a New Yorker for sure. He said, Valerie, the South is not for someone like me. The South is not for someone who is well-educated, who is gay. The South is not for anyone who's middle class and black. So I think I'll go back to New York. And I understood that. I'll end with the essence of my brother. I'll never forget one time when I saw that. He had came to Virginia to visit me, and we had just came from a store, and he was walking ahead of me. I kind of stayed back. And I remember watching his posture. As he was walking, you know, he stuck his chest out. He readjusted his neck, and he lifted up his chin. And he walked gracefully through that parking lot, looking side to side as if he owned that world. And it reminded me that my brother was someone who, and just in his presence, would, you know, he may have been afraid, but you were never going to know it. You may have not liked him, but he demanded your respect. And even in hostile territory, he was going to go with courage. And although he would do it gracefully, you'd be making a mistake if you underestimated him. So he was very strong. He was elegant, he was classy, he was kind. He was my beloved little brother. So thank you all for loving my brother as much as we do. Thank you so much for putting this together.
So I'd like to just make some very brief closing comments. One is there will be a memorial website for Marcellus to be launched very soon. If you saw the symposium booklet but didn't have time to write a tribute, you can send it to me. I will be the curator and your editor if you don't mind. And we can post it on the website along with the booklet, photos from today, Marcellus's writings. So we really want it to be a living tribute to him. Second, the party should be fabulous. So Dr. Marty Newland, who has a master's from IRAAS, will be singing, and she also has a PhD in ethnomusicology, so you can talk to her and listen to her. Also, Artis Woodhouse, a very fine pianist, is going to be playing. So there will be food, music, remarks, and dance, I hope, maybe. And then I was also thinking about Marcellus, whom I now feel like calling Marty. after today. So I feel also that his spirit is with us. So my example is the dance performance. So if you didn't know the poem that was read, that's Robert Hayden's Frederick Douglass. So read by Ruby D. So I was asking Lloyd in the green room, why did you pick that? Did you read the article that he wrote in 2007? And is that how it came to you? And he said, no, it was just somehow he came to that poem and he brought it with us. So it connected so beautifully to Kendall's remarks, and also Rosalind Morris in the booklet, page 13, she also refers to Frederick Douglass and the elegy and the morning tradition that Marty writes so beautifully of. And then the last thing I would say is I would want to thank all the speakers and participants and organizers once again for being here today, because there were so many people who helped, and it really made it a special occasion, I think, to gather together and to have his work and all the people he touched in some ways through his teaching, through his friendship, through his writings, gathered together to think about him and remember him, and I think he lives through us. So thank you.